use them, and finally converting between minutes and hours, how does that work? So let's jump right in. The most important thing is to know the formula, and there's a very easy little set of triangles. We only need one of them and use it in 3 different ways, and it looks something like this. So basically you get into your exam, you see a speed, distance, time question, and you just draw yourself your little triangle, as you can see, with your, just remember it's S, D and T. If you want to find a speed, so that's the second one, please go away email. You obviously say, okay, I want to find speed. So you say ignore the S, and you can see that when you get rid of the S, you're left with just D and T. If you want to find D for distance, then you just cover out the distance like in the second one, that's one here. And you can just say, okay, get rid of the D, you're left with just S and T. Along the bottom is multiply. And finally, you want to find the T. It gives you a fraction with D and S. Notice D is always the numerator of the fraction, so it's distance divided by speed, distance divided by time, or multiply along the bottom. How does that look in practice? So let's say you've got a question, let's say it's a speed question. How do you know it's a speed question? Well, you can see that it gives you a D, distance of 110 miles. It gives you a time of 2 hours, which is your T, and then it's just a case of saying, well, speed is D over T, because you can see there's the D, there's the T, and then you just put the numbers into the formula. This is a calculated skill, as you saw in your paper 4. Similarly, let's say it's a distance question. How do you know it's a distance question? Well, again, you can see you've got a speed of 35 meters a second. You've got a time of 4.5 seconds. And then you can see that if you get rid of the D, which is circled at the top, then you're left with just S times T. And of course, S is speed, T is time, and they're in the question. Finally, and again, this is not a super varied topic. Time, again, we want to find the T, so we get rid of the T, you're left with just the D and the S. What's the speed? Well, it's 50 miles an hour. What's the distance? Well, it's 12.5 miles an hour. And then you just substitute those into the formula. So distance on the top, speed on the bottom. Now, this seems very straightforward, and then on this simplistic level, so these questions I've given you are obviously very, very straightforward questions. What you notice from your paper 4 is that this is often combined with algebra, so it will be speed, distance, time, but within another question. So you might get a speed, distance, time to do with a graph, you might get speed, distance, time using some algebra. In your paper 4 in the winter exam, it was speed, distance, time looking at using quadratics, and I am going to do a separate video going through that question in more detail so you can see how these two things link together. The final thing you may need for a speed, distance, time question is to be able to convert between minutes and hours, or combinations of those. Just remember the simple fact that there are 60 minutes in an hour, which hopefully you are all aware of. So for this first question, okay, you can see the first question says you've got an hour and 40 minutes, you want to give it as a mixed number. Avoid the temptation to say like 1.4 times 60. That's completely wrong, because it's not out of 100, okay, it's out of 60. So what you do is basically split it up into hours and minutes. Anytime you see minutes, just think of it as a fraction. So for example, this 40 is actually 40 minutes out of 60. So essentially you've got 1 hour and 40 minutes out of 60. And then once you've got 1 hour and 40 minutes out of 60, you can say it's 1 2/3. Because 40 over 60 simplifies to 2/3. Similarly here, 3 hours comes down, but you've got 10 minutes out of 60 as a fraction. So you've got 3 and 10 over 60, which becomes 3 hours and a sixth. Again, you've got 1 hour and 6 minutes out of 60, make your fraction. And 2 hours and 18 minutes out of 60, which is 2 3/10. So basically you're making fractions out of 60 minutes, because it's 60 minutes in an hour, and that's how you do this. We can reverse engineer this for when it's the other way around, where they give you maybe a decimal or a fraction. Again, avoid the temptation to just multiply by 60. You don't need to multiply the whole thing. If you multiply by 60, so for example for this one here, if you did 4.4 times 60, that will give you something. That would give you 264. But that's how many minutes you have. But it doesn't ask you for minutes, it asks you for it in hours and minutes. So again, what we can do, however, is we can say, okay, well, I've got 4 hours, so keep that 4 hours the same. But then you've got 0.4 hours, and it's 0.4 of 60. So when you're going from the decimal back up to the minutes, just multiply by 60. And that would give you 4 hours and 24. Oh, no, I did that small. And 24 minutes. Again, calculator exam. Here, 1 hour and 0.2 hours, which will give you 1 hour and 12 minutes. When you've got a quarter, same thing, 1 hour, and then you've got a quarter times 60. Use your calculator. And finally, 3 hours, and then 0.7 times 60. So again, using that idea of 60, and that gives you 3 hours and 42 minutes. So there's a couple of examples of how you can go from hours and minutes to a mixed number, or the other way around, going back. Just always keep in mind that don't just get into this mentality of multiplying or dividing. Okay, keep it in hours, keep it in minutes, or keep it as a mixed number. Treat the hours and the minutes separately. If you're given minutes, put them as a fraction over 60. If you're given a fraction or a decimal, multiply them by 60 to get the minutes section, but don't just multiply the whole thing. Okay, and that's basically it. So just to summarize, okay, one triangle, this one here, is the important one. So sorry, the screen's taking a bit of seconds to catch up. Okay, remember that triangle, and you can just draw that when you get into your exam. Okay, that's a T there. It's a bit of a rubbish T. As you can see from the 3 other triangles, if you want to find a speed, then you can obviously that's one with a little circle and the S. You ignore the S and it leaves you with the D and the T. If you want to find the D, ignore the D, use the S and the T. If you want to find the T, use the D and the S. So whatever you want to find out in the question, use the other 2 letters. And by reading the question, identify the 2 things you have and then substitute them into a formula. And that is speed, distance, time. And like I said, a separate video will show you how this looks when you do it in one of your GCSE questions. Bye.